Bei Wu. I'm a professor. Here with me also has Dr. Vicky Levice. She is another co-director of our Aging Incubator. So some of you actually was quite interested in how this initiative, what this initiative is about. This NYU Aging Incubator has been here for close to 2 years. It's a new initiative. It is a provost-led, university-wide initiative. The whole purpose actually is trying to promote interdisciplinary collaboration in terms of research and education across campus related to aging. Is organizing that today we are very pleased to have Dr. Michael Moss here to actually introduce his research into the audience. His presentation is accommodating and understanding the aging workforce research advances, ageism, intergenerational attention, and the related management and policy applications. His research has published in various peer-reviewed journals, including Psychological Bulletin, Personality and the Social Psychology Bulletin, and Research in Organizational Behavior. And has also the co-ed for Harvard Business Review, Applied Psychological Science. It's very impressive, has a very impressive CV.
Hope I live up to that nice intro, thank you. Really is great to be here as part of the NYU Aging Incubator. Again, it really is this cool NYU-wide initiative. There really isn't something else like it, as far as I know. This sort of tries to connect different schools at NYU with a common interest. And in this case, a common interest being one of aging, which again, it's a little depressing. I'm the only Stern representative, I believe, in the Aging Incubator, the only household name, but his name is Brian Reed. Now, Reed may not be a household name, but in many ways, he may as well be considered a founding father of the internet, at least as much as we know it. For those of you in the room who can remember back to your Netscape Navigator days, it's usually everyone about my age and older. People younger than me have no idea what I'm talking about. But Reed actually headed up the team that developed the early internet search engine Alta Vista, which was kind of Google before Google came along. And he also conducted a variety of foundational internet research as a computer science professor at Stanford. And pictured here, he looks pretty pleased with himself. And why not? Because after all, he has been lucky enough to, until he starts coming to work every day, and he realizes that his younger coworkers and his younger supervisors are addressing him in these kinds of manners. And they're letting you go, you're not a good cultural fit here. Brian, in so many words, basically says up yours and levels a pretty cast to the side as Brian Reed. Three separate parts. Part one, I'm going to talk about the aging workforce. We have historically rapid rising of workforce aging, where people are not retiring like they used to. People want to work longer than ever, and yet both know a lot about how to best accommodate this inevitable demographic trend. For part two, I'm also going to talk about the unprecedented level of workplace age diversity. I'm actually going to make the argument, which I'm not sure we always make quite as well as we should, that whenever we talk about workforce aging, or whenever we talk about an aging population, we can't do that without also acknowledging that inherently this is a multi-generations are in the workplace than ever, and the same kinds of challenges exist here as well, where we don't really know a lot about what makes for best practices as well as best scholarly approaches to unpacking and maximizing the productivity of the unprecedented level of workplace age diversity. And then finally in part three, having proposed these all go from here in order to maximize the adaptability of these inevitable demographic trends. First, this is the way to go home and convince your friends or significant others why they should care about this. But literally there are two major reasons why literally every single living person in the entire world should take stock of these demographic trends. Okay, I'm going to call this the demographic imperative on the one hand, but there's also a theoretical imperative to understand these aging workforce and multi-generational workforce trends as well. Okay, so for the demographic imperative, some of you may be familiar with this quote, some of you may not. This idea, demography is destiny, what that means is just any kind of change in the composition of the population has reverberating consequences for the population as a whole. And so from a population aging standpoint, some people call it the graying of the population, some people call it the silver tsunami, whatever population we've ever had in history. In the next 10 years, the number of people over traditional retirement age is expected to comprise 1/5 of the total population. And this is having consequences across the board, including, as I would argue, very notably in the workplace, where older segments of the labor force are the only ones projected to grow in coming decades. So you can see the workforce is becoming older, and if you look at how these squares are becoming more equivalent to one another, it is also becoming unprecedentedly intergenerational. And so what that means is that from a managerial perspective, the need to understand the different styles and communication styles and work outlooks and general attitudes toward career and life philosophies, the need to understand that between different generations has never been greater than it is today. And I wish I could say that this newly multi-generational society is ushering in an great. Actually, the argument I'm going to make today, in addition to talking about an aging workforce and an aging society, the argument I'm also going to make today is that underneath all of this, what you are seeing are the seeds of generational tension brewing. And it's not like an outright war yet, but I do want to prime you guys to this idea that you have a younger generation who's feeling increasingly frustrated and increasingly feeling like they have reduced opportunities relative. All that represents the demographic imperative. Now, I also mentioned there's also a theoretical imperative. A theoretical, quote myself, seriously, it doesn't get more obnoxious than that. As they say, couldn't have said it better myself. But in this case, it's actually true. Think about it. Age really is the only universal social category. Okay, I'm a social scientist by training. Age is different from all of the above, right? No matter who you are, we're all on this continuum, right? And we may not like to think about this every single day, but really that is the alternative, right, for the most part. We're all sort of progressing on this same continuum. Okay, and it's not just this like social society tends to distribute its resources. It tends to do so according to certain age-based cue. You can think about it as younger people don't really have a lot, but eventually they get their turn, and eventually they get a job, eventually they work their way up. At some point you are middle-aged, you make the most money, you have the most influence, you can boss people around. And then at a certain point, perhaps ill-defined point, that at a certain point, at least the expectation goes, you are older, or old, so to speak, and you're expected to sort of get off the queue and retire from your job and move to Florida and be out of sight and out of mind in a nursing home somewhere. I'm not saying that's a good thing to think, I'm just saying the expectation is there in terms of how society traditionally has distributed its resources between age groups. Now there's just one problem with this expectation. The big problem, which many of you in this room probably are well aware, is that the current older population is not stepping. In fact, what we're seeing is that more and more older people want to continue working. People aren't retiring like they used to. And by the way, we have ever had. This generational wealth gap of 47, that reflects the statistic that households who are headed by someone 65 and older are 47 times wealthier than households headed by someone 30 or younger. That is the largest, by far, generational wealth disparity we have had, at least in recent memory. That number was more like 11 just 20 years ago. So we have a growing generational wealth gap. We have this sort of tension, I would argue, that is certainly within their right, but that is creating the perception, fair or not, of creating kind of a log jam for those who want their proverbial turn. I'm not saying these perceptions are necessarily accurate, but I am saying that this perception is out there and that the risk for generational tensions are actually high, and without also talking about it as a multi-generational issue. Okay? So let's talk about part one, this idea of workforce aging. Okay, workforce aging. The big question, million-dollar question, is not just what barriers exist to utilizing an aging workforce, but how do we overcome those barriers? So from a workplace standpoint, I've thought about this a lot, because on the one hand, if you ask managers to rate the quality of work or the quality of employees, this is a large-scale survey, thousands of data points. This was conducted about 10 years ago. They asked employers, to what extent do you think this is very true? These following statements are very true of your early career versus mid-career versus late career employees. And I'll just draw your attention to the late categories. So basically, managers, relative to mid-career and early career employees, managers really favor their older employees in terms of loyalty, in terms of work ethic, in terms of being reliable, in terms of having low turnover, and so on and so forth. So on the one hand, managers really do see genuine value in their older employees. That seems like good news for a workforce that is constantly aging, where people aren't retiring like they used to. On the other, comprising three levels. There's the hiring level, onboarding. You have on the job, and then you have exit or firing, let's say, or retirement or whatever, right? You see barriers at all three of these levels with respect to older workers, as per the research. At the level of hiring, you have these audit studies where researchers mail out thousands, tens of thousands, of resumes that are matched on their qualifications. They differ only by age, generally younger or older. They find that older applicants are 40% less likely to receive even a callback for even an entry-level interview than our young job cycle as well. What about for on the job? This is actually from one of my studies. I asked participants to adopt the role of manager of training and development, asked people to basically allocate training resources between equally qualified yet differentially aged employees. You can see the white bar, people were way more likely to give the shaft to the older worker than they were level. To give a macro level statistic of what's going on here, if you look at the past 20 years at the just sheer number of age discrimination charges in this country, you can see it's not a strict linear increase, but generally speaking, for all that we talk about diversity and inclusion, age discrimination charges are very much on the rise over the last 20 years. So why do all of these barriers exist? And what are the sources of these various barriers? This is where the research can really start to help us attitudes toward older employees. If you look at the social psychology literature, my PhD is in social psychology, and you look at what researchers generally say for why ageism occurs or why negative perceptions of older adults occur, generally speaking, people have this idea that older adults are warm. It could be just general reminders of death or mortality. It could just be that older adults are seen as a burden or seen as invisible. Now, I'm not saying that all of these perceptions necessarily map on directly to older employees per se. Right? For instance, I don't think Brian Reed was let go because he was reminding other Google employees of death necessarily. But I think it's worth making the point that in general, there's a stigma around older age, and that this kind of stigma can more directly, research does show that basically one of the main reasons that so these are the kinds of attitudes that we need to work to change if we're going to make an aging workforce work. The second major barrier, I would say, I'm genuinely sorry, because it really sucks and it's really hard to prove age discrimination in court for this reason. But so much of what underlies ageism is really, really subtle, right? If you look at job descriptions, you see phrases like this, like we're looking for someone to fit in with a young team, or we're looking for someone with high ambition or willingness to learn. Now, I'm not saying that older people are not ambitious and are not willing to learn. In fact, quite the opposite. I will make the argument in a few slides. But what I am saying is that you can imagine being an older job applicant, applying for a job, seeing that they're looking for someone to fit in with a young team, or seeing that they're looking for someone with high ambition, with someone who can work long hours and nights and weekends, which is code for basically saying people in later life stages need not apply. Because people in later life stages either often have family obligations, or they might have some degree of health concerns, or they just might have a lifestyle difference where they don't want to work 70 or 80-hour weeks, which is certainly their right, so they might self-select out of those kinds of positions. You also see the same kind of language on the job, where people are often, as a result perhaps of these attitudes or coded language. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this concept of stereotype threat. The idea is that if you are a member of a stigmatized group and you are subtly reminded of the negative stereotypes associated with your group on a given task, then that is enough to undermine your performance. So in the case of older age stereotype threat, there's this perception that as you get older, you lose your memory. And so consider the research that shows that framing the exact same reading comprehension task, if you frame it as a memory task, older participants do worse. But if you frame it as impression formation or reading comprehension, all of a sudden older participants do. Domains is how old you actually feel. So if you're a 60-year-old employee, but you feel more like you're 45 and you haven't really felt different older than they are, or if you are, let's say, 90 and you feel 90, that seems to be more maladaptive, at least as of now. That's what the research shows. So there's lots of malleability here in terms of how we frame tasks and also in terms of how we frame our own age. Okay, if I can put a plug for my own work, this was a lot of my dissertation work, which is now published. Yet another barrier afflicting older workers is this idea of prescriptive stereotypes. These should-based expectations, shoulds, that target same prescriptive stereotypes that target older adults. Number one, this expectation, fair or not, that older adults should actively step aside to the healthcare system, try not to drive on the highway and get in everyone else's way. Again, fair or not, that's the perception that is out there. And number three, what I call identity. It's a more symbolic kind of thing. This idea that if you're older, you're expected to not really try to act cooler than you are. In other words, you're old, act like you're old, stop showing up, you know, to the club and dancing or something like that, something along those lines. And by the way, workplace age diversity. Again, we cannot talk about an aging society or an aging workforce without also framing it as an increasingly age diverse workforce. Which is to say that in general, from organizational behavior research, we know that diversity in general can be considered a double-edged sword. On the one hand, the more diverse your work group is, the more awkward it is, the more tense it is, the more relationship conflict manifests, the higher the risk for turnover and the higher the attenuation of social cohesion. And yet, on the other hand, the argument for diversity is that it enhances creativity and innovation. And certainly all of us in this room, we are all New Yorkers. We all at some level value diversity. That's, I think, why we choose to live here, at least partly. It's not always the more diversity of experience you have, the more creative you generally are. But the contradiction of sorts is at least as if you look at the work on age diversity, and admittedly this is a relatively niche work group or team or organization is, the more that you have this perception that some degree of age-based favoritism is occurring, right? That's not good news for a workplace or a workforce that is increasingly age diverse, is it? So why is this all happening? Again, the seed I was trying to plant earlier in all of your heads is this idea that generational tensions are a thing, and it's not a thing that we talk about enough in either workplace or in research circles. Right? This is just one AARP survey. Probably doesn't surprise too many of you who have ever worked in workplaces with a lot of different cohorts in the same place. Over 60% of 60% of workplaces report the presence of generational conflict. Over 70% of older employees dismiss the abilities of younger workers, see them as kind of useless in a sense, and the vice versa is nearly 50%. Nearly 50% of younger employees dismiss the abilities of their older colleagues. Now, why this asymmetry between 50 and over 70, I'm not sure, but in general, none of this is good news for an increasingly age-diverse workplace. And I think you can see some seeds of these tensions again at the macro level as well. As I already mentioned earlier, we have this giant intergenerational wealth gap that really there's not a ton of momentum to fit. I mean, you have Ocasio-Cortez now. I think there's going to be some more momentum toward this now. But in general, not a lot of people historically really have talked about this, at least in recent years. You also have a younger generation who has their own unemployment plight to combat. Right? On the one hand, it's really hard to get a job if you're laid off and you're over 50. That's totally something we should all be totally sympathetic to. And yet, on the other hand, you can make the argument that at least in recent memory, it's never been harder to be younger in terms of trying to find a job, in terms of trying to buy a house, start a family, and so on and so forth. For those of you who are interested in what the kids these days are doing, this is called a meme. A meme is like a viral image. You may or may not be aware of this. This pass these memes around to one another. They're sort of quippy, they're sort of funny. They have different names. You can customize the text. Just think you guys should know, this one is called the scumbag baby boomer meme. Okay? This is, you can see, this perception is out there where younger people are fair or not targeted. Or many of you maybe just be familiar with this general idea that the Millennial Generation is apparently ruining everything, whatever that means. From the napkin industry I read an article about, to chain restaurants, to like Budweiser and things like that. Apparently this generation is just absolutely wrecking everything. So it seems like, you know, in general there's this, while I'm doing that, I might as well share something with you, which when I was first starting out in grad school, and I wanted to understand tell me, what does the internet think about what quote-unquote old people should or shouldn't do? I'll admit, yes, for those of you who have not seen me present this before, what's the #1 autocomplete for old people should? Die. Yeah, dying. Driving is usually people's first guess, that's #2. Euthanized, it's kind of like dying, I guess. Driving, texting, should, don't text, should retire. Drive, text, drive, Facebook, drive. I I did not write my whole dissertation based on Google. I just want to be clear that these dimensions they don't seem to come out of nowhere. These themes really do seem to be people believe that older adults should sort of step aside and get out of the way, both literally and figuratively. And by the way, it's not so much that all people are necessarily endorsing these expectations, but really it seems to be a younger generation that is most endorsing these expectations. And I'm showing you just a simple line graph. You'll see rate or age on the x-axis. So as people get older, they tend to disagree with these kinds of statements more. Older people should retire, or that older adults shouldn't act cool, and so on and so forth. And this is from actually a published ageism scale, a prescriptive ageism scale. These items, I'm testing the generational tension thing. It's not that people all around who's either younger, middle-aged, or older, they sort of watch a brief video introduction and then they rate the partner on a variety of qualities. And basically the partner portrays himself as either sort of staying in the way and getting in the way of younger generations. So not literally getting in the way, but saying, you know what, I'm not really ready to retire yet, or I have a considerable amount of wealth, but I don't really feel like passing it along. Or they portray themselves as facilitating this sort of age-based cue. And time again, what I find is that younger people, have the most extreme reactions toward the older guy for doing this rather than the middle-aged or younger guy. So the point I'm trying to make here is that this seems to be these. All right, so let's move on to the third part of this, which is what can we do about all this? Okay, this isn't really a particularly uplifting set of messages, is it? So what can we actually do in terms of what the research says in order to try to address these issues? And again, I just want to be clear once more that I see this as a two-pronged set of issues. These are certainly related issues, but they're still separate in their own way. And so what do we do with respect to an aging workforce? How do we get organizations, employers, this is the kind of drum that I'm constantly beating teaching at a business school, trying to make the business case of sorts for why you should retain and hire and recognize truths about the actual work preferences of older workers. Now I want to be really clear. It's not that we should assume that every single worker over a certain age necessarily reflects this, nor that the person over a certain age should be forced. Instead, I think it's worth noting that if you're ever told that by an employer that you don't want to hire one older employee because they cost 3 times as much as 3 younger, a compromise or a happy medium, that I think that kind of mentality holds. In other words, this idea that over 75% of older workers, they want to continue working in some capacity, yet the vast majority want to work in sort of flexible or reduced hourly costing. So that's number one. Number two, also recognize truths about the abilities of older workers. I kind of alluded to it, is we fixate too much on aging as a negative thing, or age as a negative thing. We focus too much on this idea of declines in fluid intelligence, which is true. I'm not going to say it's not true. On average, even though there is individual variation, of course, how to use a computer, or maybe some of you in this room are that grandparent or parent who maybe are a little bit slower than your kids and have to rely on them in some compensatory processing, where even if fluid intelligence does tend to decline, or what does not decline and what may even increase with time, with age. They may be just neuroticism. You become more zen as you get older. You become more holistic in your processing. You sort of see the big picture a lot more than you used to. By the way, you also use, at least in terms of generational difference, greater language complexity, greater emotional well-being, greater reasoning, and greater loyalty to the company, and so on and so forth. So again, this fixation on age as inevitably a sign of decline, to me makes no sense from a business. Really tiny tweaks that don't cost a lot of money that can actually serve to not only signal that you value diversity and inclusion, but really actually tap into bottom line value that can be extracted from retaining your older workers. Often create win-win situations. I am shocked by how many companies continue to be so backward thinking in terms of how to enact organizational practices and are not thinking in a forward-thinking way about how to accommodate older workers. Okay, so that's the aging workforce. What about the multi-generational workforce? And now this question, how do we get generations to see eye to eye, a really alarmingly unresolved question in any field, at least as far as I know, at least in the fields that I tend to associate with. Well, one thing that I don't think is helping anything is this idea of these sort of narratives that generations are in competition with one another. And I didn't really think generational narratives aren't really as true as we think they are. In other words, I think when people assume that boomers and millennials are in competition with one another, or when people assume that older and younger workers can't coexist because as one wins, the other loses, consider what the research shows. At least Pew Charitable Trust conducted this study where they looked at 40 years worth of economic data, and they actually found that the outcomes between older workers and younger workers, in other words, as the economy does well, all age groups seem to get employment and make more money. As the economy does poorly, everyone loses. It's not so much that as older workers do better, younger workers do worse. At least in the case of age, the so-called lump of labor theory, this idea that there's a fixed amount of labor to go around between generations, does not seem to hold true. And this pattern actually replicates not just in the United States, but also in Europe. Okay, this is another drum I've continued to be beating, and I do not think this fixation on generational competition is really helping anybody. All those memes I showed you, the sort of narratives about millennials ruining everything, none of this is really helping matters at all for a society and a workplace that is increasingly. One of my old studies, I had younger participants read an article about the aging population, but they read one of two versions. They either read enough resources around to go around between generations, or they read an abundant version where experts believe that there would be enough resources to go around between generations. In the abundant frame, younger participants were more willing and more excited about professionally connecting with an older colleague than they were when they read the scarce version. Okay, so where do we go from here? Current future directions. There's like 5,000 future directions. I'm just going to talk about 3 really quickly, and then I'll be done, and I'd be curious to hear your thoughts. So number 1, how do we harness productive age diversity? Clearly, whatever we're doing, my feeling is that we're treating age diversity much like we treat any other kind of diversity, but that we shouldn't be doing that. In other words, we assume that if we get people of diverse backgrounds in the room and sort of get them talking, that eventually the magic will happen. That doesn't seem to be what is emerging. But at least what me and my colleagues and I have been trying to argue is that that kind of approach is diversity. There's real wisdom to be gleaned from having older or senior colleagues. I know I have benefited from it myself, being in my department. In general, there's real wisdom that can be gleaned from the older generation to really explicitly highlight that kind of value and maturity in the workplace. We have some evidence already that if you remind younger people of the value of maturity, not only do they or if you get people thinking about a time when they were surrounded by maturity, it can actually spill over and make them sort of act in more conscientious ways. That's the kind of recipe, as I see it, that can really harness productive age diversity. Again, a recipe which, as of now, has been elusive to date. Okay, that's number 1. Number 2, contextual differences. So some of you are probably looking at my slides and saying, okay, that makes certain sense, but what about blank? Okay, I'm with you. What about blank is like a lot and assertively. In other words, those prescriptive stereotypes, those prescriptive expectations that I was telling you about before, they seem to target older men more than older women. And so in some ways, I don't know exactly why that is. The mechanism we implicate is that older women are seen as less of a threat to power and resources than older men are. At least that's the theory we are going with. Happy to hear your thoughts about that. I do think it gets better message for women that eventually, it's not like the glass ceiling completely shatters, but if you stick it out long enough, let's say it attenuates a little bit, at least from this one perspective. Happy to talk about that. Also, what about ageism against the young? What about perceptions against the young? Again, there's all this millennial bashing out there, basically zero academic work out there as to what actually drives those perceptions. Finally, kind of a philosophical question that's also a pragmatic one in my mind, which is what is an older worker? What are we talking about when we're talking about an older worker? If you look at this literature, which again is relatively small to begin with, it's like comically all over the place. Like some people conceptualize an older worker as being 37, others conceptualize an older worker as being 75. There doesn't seem to be much rhyme or reason. It's often done either in a really specific context or with no context at all. What are we talking about? Is basically my question here. So I have a theory paper coming out in a management journal where basically, if we're talking about an older worker, what we're really talking about are at least 4 primary components that are heavily intertwined. That is, that older worker is a member of a certain generation, they're of a certain life stage, they've accumulated a certain amount of organizational tenure with their current company, and they've accumulated a certain amount of experience. And the problem with this idea of just slapping a chronological age on that one person is that if you isolate these 4 different dimensions, you start to get different outcomes, right? For example, in terms of perceptions, people are more favorable in general, probably, it's not probably, it actually is true. People view an experienced worker more favorably than they do a boomer worker, let's say. Sorry for the boomers in the room, but it's all about a labeling thing, right? It's all about what kind of impression do you want to give from an age standpoint. If we just slap a number and say, well, we need to accommodate a 65-year-old worker or whatever, there needs to be more complexity than that to really get the full scope of what we are actually talking about when we're talking about trying to accommodate an aging workforce. So this is my last slide. This is my research website. Feel free to I actually have cards if that would be of use. It's age@nyu.org. It's like a fledgling center that I'm trying to build here at Stern, the first of its kind at any business school. Call it the AGE Initiative. AGE is an acronym, stands for Accommodating Generations in Employment. I thought it was pretty clever myself. But the basic idea is really there's no other business school in the world basically that is dedicating this kind of attention. At least I'm trying to lead this effort to dedicate this kind of attention to these issues surrounding the aging workforce and the multi-generational workforce. So if any of you want to get involved, including if you want to be a study participant, feel free to visit our link, click participate, and you can participate in our studies. Or if anyone knows of any funding opportunities or want to partner in said funding opportunities, I would be more than happy to do that because I'm always on the hunt for that. Thank you guys for coming. I really appreciate it.